Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are watching from other places around the world, different time zones. We know there are quite a few of you out there who have tuned in. It's a real pleasure to be here at the NYU Center for Global Affairs. Good friends that are on this team, and I'm really pleased to be here. It's been a while since we've been here in person. In fact, this is the first in-person UN academic impact program that we've done since COVID, since the pandemic. So we're really pleased to be able to have it here at NYU at the Center for Global Affairs. I'll introduce myself. I'm Robert Skinner. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief of Partnerships and Global Engagement in the Department of Global Communications at the United Nations. We're very good at very long titles at the United Nations. So yeah, that's a lot. And I sometimes have to remind myself all the aspects of it. And as I said, it's great to be here, great to be part of what we're doing here. And I thank NYU and CGA folks for being here. I also thank my team at Academic Impact for putting this all together. You know, just before the general debate started on Tuesday at the United Nations, Monday was a big day. There's always a high-level event at the UN. It kicks off the week focused on the Sustainable Development Goals or aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. And following the SDG moment, which was a major moment to look at the entire agenda, there's an entire day spent on education for the Transforming Education Summit, which serves as the framework for the conversation we're having here today. And the key takeaway, I think, that we heard from leadership there, particularly our Secretary General Antonio Guterres, was we need to learn to live together, learn to do action, and learn to be. You know, just work together, cooperate, collaborate, and be together as we try and tackle the enormous challenges that we face as a global community. And thinking about the impact that the academic community can have is really critical. All that the academic community globally brings to our path against these crises. And it's just clearly a critical driver of the 2030 agenda. You know, and I think all of us here and all of us watching around the world can make a significant contribution and need to make a significant contribution. And particularly as we're thinking about how higher education will impact education, you know, at all levels. I mean, the Transforming Education Summit was looking at all levels of education, probably a little bit less of a focus on higher education, but we need to be thinking about it as an academic community, what we can bring to the table to help make up for the lost years that we've had in COVID. I mean, the statistics in some cases are really staggering on the years lost by our children, but not just by our children, by, you know, learners of all ages. So we need to be addressing that and thinking about it. So again, I'm very honored to moderate this first panel. It's a two-panel event. The first one is in person at NYU and online. The second is purely online. We'll get to that later this morning here in New York time. And this event is titled "The Role of Higher Education: Transformation of Education for the Realization of the SDGs." Again, a little bit of a long title, but I think it covers really what we need to be doing, what we're here to talk about. First, unfortunately, one of our panelists was not able to join us today. I mean, as everyone knows, it's a crazy week in New York. But fortunately, she was able to send a video. And so we're going to run that first after I introduce the speaker. And then the panelists are here present in the room. We'll all take our seats and get the presentation started, and then we'll open to Q&A and conversation. So first, I'd like to introduce the video. It is from Dr. Priya Joshi, who is a senior research officer at the Global Education Monitoring Report of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. She is a specialist on non-state actors in education and education's role in the Sustainable Development Goals. Exactly what we're here to talk about. So we will run that video, and then following the video, I'll ask the panelists, our conversationalists, to join me on stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance to provide some limited remarks on the issue of the role of higher education for a future fit education. My name is Priya Joshi. I'm a senior research officer with the Global Education Monitoring Report, UNESCO. I'm a specialist on the role of non-state actors in education and on education's role in the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me first begin by saying that to articulate how higher education needs to transform for the future, it is important to take stock of where higher education stands today. I work at the Global Education Monitoring Report, which has been the main accountability mechanism for education for the last 20 years. We've monitored education progress globally from 2002, and we continue to monitor all levels of education, including higher education. When we think about global trends in higher education, we find that the global participation in tertiary education has reached 118 million women and 110 million men in 2019. This represents a steady increase of 1 percentage point per year since 2000. So one of the things that we have truly focused on in the report is the question of affordability of higher education. We find that the student loans of various kinds have grown into $1 trillion market. They're available in over 70 countries. The average share of tertiary students receiving loans in 19 mostly high-income countries was 40%. We also find that non-state institutions have a large role to play in providing access. In India, about 40% of private colleges were only offering one field of study, which means that they were responding to the market. Substantial numbers of teachers in the Global South are also trained in non-state institutions. Since many of these institutions are fee charging with very little state assistance, this really increases the inequity of the higher education systems around the world. About the role of education in sustainable development. The way we have approached it at the GEM report is that education and lifelong learning for all, if formulated in the right way, can lead to a more sustainable future for all. And it requires, a work on all types of learning, informal systems and non-formal systems, and informal systems as well. When we turn to the question of the role of higher education for the future, the SDGs are a particularly good framing because they're a comprehensive agenda with a lot of careful thought on what is required for a sustainable future. Every sector, of course, needs qualified professionals. Beyond higher levels of formal education among the professionals in each sector, there is a need to focus on improvements amongst professionals so that they have holistic training, they have engagement with communities, and flexibility in using approaches to tackle flexibility in their approaches in tackling problems. So when we look at, for example, SDG 3, which is the goal for health, there is a clear indication that there's a global shortage of healthcare workers, including doctors, nurses, and teachers. These challenges are especially acute in poorer countries, and also exacerbated by the fact that there's a high international mobility, which incentivizes doctors and nurses from African, Asian, and Caribbean countries to go to higher income countries. When we think about teachers, the region with the lowest number of qualified teachers is Sub-Saharan Africa. It's estimated that Sub-Saharan Africa will need to recruit 15 million new teachers, 15 million teachers by 2030 to staff schools for a maximum pupil-teacher ratio of 40 in primary and 25 in secondary levels. Similarly, when we look at peace and justice, an estimated 4 billion people lack access to justice, which means that there's a major role for higher education institutions to play to improve training of lawyers and judges, but also professionals within the law, within law. Another, as mentioned earlier, the other aspect of this is a sort of a fundamental transformation of how education is happening in these sectors. For instance, for SDG 7, which is the energy goal, to achieve the Paris Agreement target requires professionals who have very diverse profiles and working in very different industries to implement unprecedented energy transition strategies. When we look at SDG 11, which is the goal for cities, Capacity building and well-trained professionals are critical because they will help deliver on the new urban agenda. They need to engage in multidisciplinary participatory processes. Academic planning programs need to integrate physical, social, and environmental challenges together. And that they need to improve local officials' capacity to engage in issues of local relevance and also encourage and support their networking. So to wrap up what I had shared, future fitting higher education requires acknowledging the big challenges of the present and ensuring that there's an adequate focus on inclusion, access, and affordability. From a pedagogical standpoint, a multidisciplinary flexible approach, a project-based learning, engagement with communities, and an eye on current research will help prepare graduates at all levels to engage and deal with the uncertainties we are facing today and in the future. I thank you for your time.
Thank you all for joining us as we have gotten started with the event, which again is entitled "The Role of Higher Education in the Transformation of Education for the Realization of the SDGs." And the way this program is going to roll out, I'm going to ask each of the participants here to speak for a few minutes about what they're seeing in the education space, the higher education space as it relates to the SDGs. Any thoughts they have on what they heard or saw at the Transforming Education Summit on Monday. And then after we've had presentations from each of the four, we will then go into a more conversational tone. So please be thinking of questions you might want to ask the panelists as we go forward. And that's for those of you here in the room, but also those of you who are joining us online. Again, welcome to all of you joining us online from various locations around the world. And so what I'm going to do here is, rather than introduce the panelists, all four of the panelists, I'm going to take them one at a time, so they'll be fresh in your mind as they make their opening remarks and have the opportunity to speak. And we sort of drew straws like about 15 minutes ago to choose the running order here, and everyone was a good sport about what straw they drew. So, so the number one slot went to Mr. Sarmad Khan, who is a board director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System, or ACUNS. He is also the co-author of the upcoming book, The Sustainable University of the Future, Reimagining Higher Education and Research. He was head and senior policy advisor of the Resident Coordinator System Leadership Branch at the United Nations Development Operations Coordination Office. So Sarmad's in a good place to kick us off. So Sarmad, please.
The short end of the straw. Rob, thank you very much. Thank you to the UN Academic Info. Microphone's on.
No?
Okay,
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, UN Academic Impact, NYU, for the invitation and for setting up this space for conversation and dialogue around these issues of future fit higher education and how we can all collectively in this conversation double click on that issue and open up some important files around this topic. What I want to begin with is well, first of all, observations from the Transforming Education Summit. I think it's from my understanding, the first time in the General Assembly where the issue of curriculum and capabilities and skills was ever mentioned. And if you glance back to the Brundtland report that defined sustainable development 35 years ago and talked about the importance of education and institutions of higher education, looking at playing a key role in that conversation. Fast forward 5 years from the Rio Summit, 30 years back, the Agenda 21 that came out of the Rio Summit, interestingly called Our Common Future, talked about the importance of higher education, of building skills that are critical to look at sustainable development issues. So here we are, 30 years into the conversation and the educational sustainable development discourse. So it's a real milestone, and it's not the beginning, but it's definitely encouraging to go forward from this juncture. On the issue of curriculum in higher education, this is something we haven't been getting right. There's been, I wouldn't say a crisis in the educational system, although the issues around its role and its ability to really play that fulcrum in communities, to connect with society, to connect with academia, to connect with industry, and also connect with other educational institutions to really harness that knowledge and look at playing a key role in offering them solutions through research that address sustainable development challenges. The transition, not only for higher education, but it's also been from the MDGs to the SDGs. And in the United Nations, we also struggled with that challenge. We have an integrated, transformative, universal agenda. However, the thinking and the mindset shift didn't actually occur from that project-based thinking of the SDGs into integrated solutions. And our senior leaders, our country teams, were grappling with these issues and how to not only do we articulate the differences to governments on MDGs to SDGs, but how can we meaningfully engage in looking at drawing out solutions and new thinking and exploring partnerships and collaboration in different ways. And to be able to do that, we needed some new tools. In higher education, the curriculum at this point doesn't offer up those tools to be able to engage productively and meaningfully in addressing these issues. There's no frameworks. There's an absence of a focus on capabilities and skills, which is seen into curriculum. Their knowledge is also very discipline focused, so there is an interdisciplinary component to it that's been very limited at this point. So what do? How can we approach this issue and ensure that higher education, like the United Nations, that started to rethink its approaches on how to engage in these problems and look at solutions rather than just one-off initiatives? Let's take a look at the role of higher education to be able to play a critical function in helping graduate leaders to be able to look at sustainable development challenges, not only in their communities, but in their countries, also regional and at the macro level. So this needs to be the guiding force and the focus of curriculum in higher education, particularly in the sustainable development era and beyond. So how do we do that? Let's just say that the current thinking and approaches and the system and model for higher education isn't allowing us to get to the point where we need to be able to infuse this into the experience. What I'm proposing, and based on my experience and research, not only in the UN system, but also applying this in higher education, particularly UAE universities, University of the Future initiative, where I was testing out some of these ideas and models and came up with and applied what I call the ACT model. And in order to really shift the conversation and look at the importance of new thinking in students, it's important to start infusing into the curriculum capabilities and skills for adaptive learning, changing behaviors and changing mindsets, and adapting to the changing and changing context of the world we live in. Once we go through a 3-4 year curriculum, the world has changed. The world changes from year to year. We also saw that in COVID. How do you adapt? And do they have the skills, no matter what vocation they choose? Do you have the skills to be able to navigate nimbly those complex spaces and deal with those complex issues? Collaboration. Not only from the point of view of working together and looking at solutions and looking at addressing challenges differently, but how do we collaborate? in terms of agile coordination, who do we collaborate with. This is important, drawing on many different insights from different sectors of society. Irrespective of what stream you're in higher education, it's important to draw on those insights and knowledge. A key example is I'll be very quick with this one, but I find it, 300 years ago, one of the biggest global development or challenges was the issue of longitude, where merchant ships, navies only had dead reckoning to see the land above, and they had to just kind of go by intuition. They figured out latitude by looking at the sun, but there was a lot of crashes. And what the tipping point there, 1,200 British Navy men lost their lives. The Longitude Act was enacted, and there was almost like a global crowdsourcing. Who can come up with a solution for this problem? And it wasn't a cartographer, it wasn't a sailor, it wasn't an engineer, it wasn't even Isaac Newton could figure it out. But the solution came from the clock maker, who was able to look at trends. And now we have the chronometer. That's just one example of that. There's insights and knowledge and understanding of different from different experiences that can help contribute to co-creating solutions together. So collaboration in a way that will draw on those insights and important higher education to not just look at interdisciplinary, but with the intention of engaging conversations around sustainable development challenges across those departments. Lastly, transformation. If you can change your thinking and mindsets and be able to adapt very quickly and iterate and experiment together in new ways of collaboration and bringing on insights from various different sectors, you can truly, at an individual level and at a collective level, transform the way you engage in looking at not only yourself as a collective, but transform the way you engage and come up with solutions for the betterment of society. And this is about solutions, but also scaling that impact. The transformation does happen from that point of view. An important philosophy within that is the philosophy of praxis, where we need to connect back theory and practice and not have it separated. Higher education, over the course of many years, has separated that intellectual, theoretical understanding and how to use knowledge, but less on the practice. So what we need to do is shift and move from that knowledge to know-how continuum throughout the education process within higher education. So ultimately, three things that higher education as a framework can look at, which I call the 3 C's. It's cultivating capabilities, with that adaptive thinking and the adaptive learning to rapidly iterate, to rapidly shift, connecting knowledge through different insights and perspectives to be able to solve these collective action problems together, and cultivating networks, which means looking outside of the discipline that you're working in, being able to seek and draw out those insights from all sectors of society. And that is the only way you can look at coming up with creative and innovative solutions to problems, even in your communities, even at the regional level, even at the macro level. The importance of higher education is creating those leaders who are going to be the guardians of our natural world. And for them to be able to play that role effectively, they need to change and adapt the way they think. And this is not only important so that they can come out with a richer sense of who they are, but a more important sense of what they value and what they value for themselves and how they can create value for others, and how they want to navigate this world once they leave those halls of learning and go out into the world and do, no matter what they do, focus on, that they are coming out with that importance of what is my contribution to improving people around me on the planet.
Great, great. Thank you so much. I was impressed when you took us back 22 years to the beginning of the MDGs, but you took us back 300 years to find solutions, which was even a bit better. But thank you for that, because I think you really touched on a lot of points that we need to be thinking about it. I think what I love about the group of speakers that we have here is they're all representing organizations that are looking at that collaboration, looking at curricula, and looking at those kinds of things. And I think you laid that out and set it up very well as we continue the conversation. And with that, I'm now pleased to turn the floor to Dr. Priya Joshi. She is the head of Principles and Responsible Management Education at the United Nations Global Compact, which is a lot of events this week. I'm sure you've been incredibly busy. And she was a professor and chair and executive director at the SPS Center for Sustainable Markets at the Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden. Dr. Joshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, United Academy Impact and NYU for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful panel. Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'm happy I made it down here on my bike in the rain. But I'm here. Yes, it has indeed been a wonderful week already. Starting out on Friday with the TESS Transforming Education Summit, with a focus on youth in the UN building all day long, which was a terrific day. And of course, continuing on Saturday, where I was fortunate enough to co-organize 2 panels where we focused in particular on how the private sector engages in higher education. And that's sort of where I come from, and it's that sort of space of the higher education institutions that I'm going to focus on here initially in my few opening remarks. What we also heard very clearly on Friday morning from Jeff Sachs, your boss, was, well, it may be so that there are 17 goals and they're all interconnected. We realized that. But what he very much focused on was SDG 4 being the one and only number, the top one for us to focus on to have a just transition. Of course, I was very happy to hear that, and I'm sure the rest of the panel was too. So, and again, just to reiterate what you said, yes, indeed, this is the 77th General Assembly in the UN. This is the first time there's been a particular focus for 3 days and beyond, and all else that's happening during this week on education, and of course for us on higher education. So it's wonderful what is coming out of the week, the declarations, the conventions, the discussions, the youth declaration that came out on Thursday, not just the declaration itself, but of course all the work that has built up to it, and all the work that we now have to want to engage for even a further focus on how education matters for the world. So I think that it is very exciting, everything that's going on here, and I'm very, again, happy to be here. Myself, thank you for the wonderful introduction of me, but just to say that right now I'm heading up the Prime in the UN Compact Office for the past 2.5 years, but I've been teaching for 25 years. I've been there teaching undergraduates, graduates, executives, PhD, the whole thing, as a professor for many years. So I've been in the classroom, I've done my research in the management sphere, and I bring that now into practical discussions also for the more than 860 schools that are signed up around the world to the initiative of Prime. And let me just start by continuing on one of the numbers that Dr. Priya Joshi so wonderfully brought to us. I was counting the 118 million men and the 110, I think, was women in higher education, 228 million students, and this is each year. Out of those 228 million students, about 70 million of those students graduate each year around the world with a degree, undergraduate, in leadership, in management, in business. 1/3 is 30% of all the students who graduate come out with a leadership education. It is by far the largest study in the world. So it matters what we bring into those classrooms. It matters the theories, the frameworks, the mindsets that we engage those students in. It's a huge responsibility for us as business schools, as management schools, to educate those millions of youth who will go into the multinational companies, to the small, medium-sized enterprises, or who will even start up their own businesses with those mindsets that we have trained them with in the classrooms. And let me also again just remind you that we know that around 50% of the world's 20 largest economies, their countries. But guess what the other 50% of the largest, 20 largest economies in the world are? Those 10 largest other economies are business. So huge corporations who are as rich and powerful as countries. So it is not a trivial endeavor, again, what we do with those 70 million students we educate each year. And again, for me, being in the classroom, still, looking at curriculum, looking at the strategy courses, looking at the finance courses, the accounting courses, the operation, the marketing, the organization theory courses that we bring into the classroom, I just want to say that it is very oriented towards a short-termism, a shareholder as primary stakeholder, meaning, profit maximization is still sort of the name of the game and what is being taught in the classroom. And it is also very much a focus on the disciplinary focus that we have already heard on, that you also touched upon, that is being brought in there to the classroom. There's also another little sad news I want to bring here to the table, and that is, there's some research showing us that those students, when they start off, as freshmen, in the first year, they come with a very much sort of outer, in the terminology, and outer orientation, meaning they are in it for society. They want to be engaged in society. They want to do something for society. When we train them 3 or 4, 5 years later, when they sort of depart from our institutions, they come with a much more self-orientation. They are much more concerned about salary increase, the kind of job advancement, etc. that they can get. So I'm very, very interested in what is it we do to these students during those 3 to 5 years, and how can we improve that? So what I heard during tests and during the 2 days where I was invited to participate was a focus on 4 issues. The needed curriculum change. We need to change the definition of what success looks like. Success is what I said before, short-termism, shareholder orientation, disciplinary focus. We need to focus on another definition of success, where success as a business, success as a business leader of the world has to do with societal betterment. Instead of putting the corporation at the center, and the corporation is indeed one of the most impactful agents we have in the world, no doubt about that, but instead of putting the corporation at the center, what would the curriculum look like if you put society at the center? So we are there to serve as business, society. It will make a huge shift in the way we form the strategy curriculum, finance curriculum, etc. So, number 1 out of 4, curriculum change. 2, skill set development. Skill set development, we know from a lot of different surveys, for example, World Economic Forum, talking about that there is a huge leadership skill set gap. We need much more analytical thinking, critical thinking, innovativeness, leaders who are able to think across disciplines and creativity. We even talk about empathy. You need to be able to put yourself in the place of the other in order to be a good business leader for the world. So how does that reflected in the classroom? How do we ensure that our students, when we graduate, they come out with these skill sets? I think, and that's what we're trying to do in Prime right now, that it is to do one scale, we have to focus on the professor. We need to focus on that professor in the classroom and the way the professor brings about those new skill sets, because it's beyond the curriculum. And I can speak for myself because I've been for 20 years plus professing to my students, like I'm professing to you now, speaking to you, totally pacifying you out there, instead of actually engaging you, asking you questions, or having you to ask the questions and reflect upon the kind of learning, the kind of student agency that we really need to train our students in, and we need to create context for that. So skill set development is number 2. Number 3, we need to ensure that what we bring into the classroom has practical relevance for students. Far too often when I've been traveling the global south here over the past year and talking to deans in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, far too often what is brought into the classroom are northern-based curriculum. Something developed based on businesses, based on organizations, on dilemmas in the global north, in Europe, in North America. We can ask ourselves, is that practical relevance if you're sitting in Rwanda, if you are a student in Bangkok, or if you are a student in Rio de Janeiro? Probably not. So we need to ensure that it's not 10-year-old Harvard business case studies that are brought into the classrooms everywhere around the world. It needs to be practical, it needs to be relevant, and it needs to be also timely, here and now, because the world is moving fast as we know. The fourth thing that I heard again over tests over those 2 days, and something we discussed a lot also in Prime, is the global impact. I think it's fair to say that our friends and colleagues in the engineering sciences, in the natural sciences, the medical sciences, the biologists, etc., are very, very good, are very excellent actually in telling the rest of the world and evidencing how they make an impact, a societal impact. We are much less so in the social sciences, and the social sciences including, of course, the business schools. We have not, made a good enough effort, I think, to actually prove, to evidence what kind of societal impact we have on the world. And again, think back on 1/3 of all students who graduate. We have not made that narrative clear to the rest of the world, and we do have a societal impact. We need to collectively develop that global impact narrative much more significantly. So thank you. These were my first words. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nadette. I mean, there's a really interesting observations around the importance of the folks graduating with management degrees, business degrees, and making sure that they're involved in the solutions. I think, unfortunately, that's been forgotten a little bit. I think historically, as we think about taking on these global challenges, and there's so many coming out and graduating in this space, we have to think about what their leadership is going to look like as they go into these roles in business, and just the intersection between business, private sector, and academia, and philanthropy, NGOs, governments, all that collaboration, which I'm not referring to as collaboration, it has to be cross-sectoral in the private sector, and the leaders in that space have to be brought into these solutions. So thank you for that. So next of our speakers is Dr. Patrick Paul Walsh, who is the Vice President of Education and Director of the SDG Academy at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He is also Professor of International Development Studies and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development Studies at the University College Dublin in Ireland. Dr. Walsh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the kind invitation. It's great to be here at NYU, and it was the first in person. I know it's hybrid with UNAI. So delighted to be here. I had a slide deck that I was going to talk to, but I think what we'll do is we can send it to people online and they can look at it. So I'm going to talk to a different set of things. So first thing, I think it is worth people online looking at Jeffrey Sachs's opening to the Solutions Day of the Transforming Education Summit. Okay, it actually was trending on TikTok, etc. So, but it really just pointed out, education as the great enabler. And even Guterres himself, when he addressed the youth at the end of the Youth Engagement Day, was very clear. If you want peace and security, what's the answer? Education. If you want us to, to be able to address the great global challenges in sustainable development, including the Paris Agreement, what do we need? We need education, and he kept going on. But I guess what Jeff was pointing out, though, is that education is so important. Why is the focus not there? Why has it never really been until the 77th General Assembly where we've actually put a spotlight on it? Why are we not putting the money where our mouth is? I mean, and he was showing the arithmetic of public expenditures and the focus of the international financial arena. And honestly, we've never really had a global fund for education, and we've never really had that emphasis on it. So that's one thing with the homework. The professor's coming out of the first homework. The second thing I want to say is that just listening to the other speakers, I'm an academic and I work in a university, but I do recognize some of the issues that have been brought up. So the first question that was brought back to me was, I used to teach mathematical economics for economists, right? And the first time I ever saw this type of education was a guy who came in. I was in Trinity College Dublin at the time in the Department of Economics, and a guy, Dylan Sunderland, came in, an English guy from Newcastle, and he, at the time, we thought it was a good idea to have one elective to broaden your horizons. So it was called the Horizons elective, right? And he came in with a deck, and he says, I'm teaching the MDGs. And of course, at that stage, I said, what's the MDGs? And he was in development goals, right? So this is back in 2002. And I looked at how he did it, you know, and how he integrated the approach he took. And it was a spectacularly good course, but it's just that he embraced interdisciplinarity, but he also embraced all the different modalities of how to teach, etc. Because he had to, because he had nurses, his engineers, his doctors, so he had to come up with a different way of teaching, right? So of course, when his contract was up, he got a permanent job somewhere else. You know, the head of school said, who's going to teach this? And I said, okay, I think I like this, so I had to go. And to be fair, I've taught the MDGs and SDGs the last 20 years. This is something that I've done, right? But I do recognize that there's still a lot of academics who are very much in their silos in the way they teach and what they're doing. It's something you have to start thinking about. The second thing is, for whatever reason, I used to work, I'm president now of a thing called Statistical Society, so it's the Social and Statistical Advisory Society of Ireland, which is since 1847, all government department people, corporate unions, academics meet 7 times a year to discuss issues of public policy. Right? So I've always been open to the idea that when I do my work, I do work in cartels and mergers and predatory pricing and stuff, that I have no problem going into government departments. I have no problem going into parliaments, working with legislators, bringing it to legislative change. And it was just a mindset. I kind of felt, yes, I did my theoretical article, but I'm going to bring this to the end. You know, outside, and this is what Jeffrey Sachs does all the time. There's no fear of saying, you know, we have to bring this to impact, right? And that's a different mindset. And it's not that academics don't want to do this. Of course they do. It's just how to do this or be incentivized to do this, right? So, yes, just to talk about the SDG Academy. So we have obviously a lot of curriculum for academics, really, you know, to teach all aspects of the SDGs. And we are starting on a road, though, where we're opening up to global schools, professional corporates, public administration, and we're going down that road of certification, and also roads like MicroMasters and online MicroMasters, online master's degrees. Anyone out there, particularly in the global south, who's interested in coming on board with us, where we can show you how to do this, because we have this experience of getting on the decks and how to do this sort of thing, right? The other thing we do is Mission 4.7, which is a coalition of UNESCO, Ban Ki-moon Center, Columbia University, SDG Academy, global schools, Untitled Academy of Science and Social Science. This is the idea that you've got to think of education, and of course this is the backdrop of the Transforming Education Summit, that you've got to think of education as lifelong learning, right? And some people, like I think we were the only session in TESS that really banged the drum for HEI, or for higher education, is that for me, it's just very clear that curriculum in lower levels of schooling is set by government officials, but by academics in universities. It's also very clear, obviously, we do our own training, professional training, as the first lady pointed out, UNESCO, but also when it comes to professional training and lifelong learning, you know, this is something where universities will be centered to as well, right? So to leave universities out of that picture, to me, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So just to say, I'll give you another paper that I'm going to send you when you're online. I have a little article in Horizons. This is the International Universities Association, which just points out, just to back up some of the points, of this idea of the knowledge in a global commons that we need to achieve the SDGs or to create a safe operating space for humanity, right? And there's three things that you've got to worry about. Do you actually have the SDG knowledge? Is that there? Is it in the curriculum? Is it in the research, the policy papers? You know, is it really there? Because there's a lot of knowledge that's not necessarily for virtue. You know what I mean? Like so you have to somehow ask the question, is that knowledge there? And unfortunately, we put a lot of resources into the top 200 universities or 500 universities, and how much of that is SDG knowledge, right? And it's a paywall, and etc. Then the second thing is we do have to transfer that knowledge to the global sector. Like, so this is not in your rankings, this is not in your incentives, but again, my university, we've always had a history of twinning with East African universities and doing something around working with the global sector. I can't overemphasize how important it is to build capacity in the global south, and this would be the mission of the UNAI, etc. And then lastly, we do have to put resources and capacity into what I call the science policy practice interface, and we've addressed this already, right? And this won't happen by telling academics to do it. You've got to actually build committees and the infrastructure and centers to do this, okay? So my last thing I wanted to get to, we've had a team or a partnership that's been working on UNESCO's OER recommendation, as it's called. You should read it. Open Education Resource Recommendation. It's the closest thing to a legally binding agreement you have with UNESCO. And actually all governments have mandated that education resources, which include syllabus, curriculum, data, papers, policy, they have to be free and they have to be actually distributed across the world. And everyone has agreed to this. If we don't have free education resources, we can't have education as a global public good. So on the road, we've already presented at the UN Science Technology Innovation Forum, where we highlighted we actually have a digital highway or digital infrastructure where we can transform or transfer OERs. It's called libraries. It's called library systems in the UN and right across the world through ATIs and etc. They use technology. If you go to their annual conference, which was in Dublin a couple of weeks ago, I mean, NASA does not have the technology that's going on in these library information systems, right? And it's just unused, right? A whole army to distribute your work, okay? So bringing that onto the pre-summit in Paris and then bringing it on to Solutions Day was a very nice partnership led by SDSN and organized by SDSN, UN Impact, the Government of Ireland, the Government of Ghana, and the other partners. We presented, and I'd encourage you to look at it. So CR4, Move 4 on Solutions Day, and we presented this solution offering. And it's just to say, look, all academic knowledge, doesn't matter if you package it as data or research or your workspace, or like Blackboard or Canvas or Courseworks or whatever it is, can be collapsed into a repository. You can put an open license on it or a Creative Commons license on it. You can actually put metadata, which has been developed by the UN Library and Taxonomy, and a taxonomy on it. That means that people can translate, repurpose, update. You can push it through all the libraries around the world. And to me, this could be a massive enabler for people to do. Right? So we don't need every academic to do this, but if you are interested in this and you think just like me, some crazy person that you've taught the MDGs and SDGs and really taken on board the Sustainable Development Agenda for the last 20 years, and you want to share your course or curriculum, contact us, because we'll show you how to protect your intellectual property, how to metadata, taxonomy, put all sorts of layers on it, and how to distribute it, right? This partnership will be working on this, but I'll stop here. So thank you for the invitation.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. There was a lot of truths you said there. The first truth that I noticed was that Dr. Sachs says what he thinks. He's not afraid to say what he thinks. He certainly does. But also really important is just access. Having the access to whether it's the research, the data, the ability to teach, how to teach the curriculum, to make sure that that's accessible to anyone who wants to teach it wherever they are. And going back to this point, to make sure that it's relevant to the space where that's being taught. I mean, I think that's really critical. And so you have to be sharing. we just keep coming back to collaborating, working together, and sharing that information. So great. And then number 4 on the list of when we drew the straws was Dr. Carolyn Hussein, who is a clinical professor, academic director of the graduate programs in global affairs and global security, conflict, and cybercrime at the Center for Global Affairs, and director of the SPS Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab of New York University, right here. Dr. Hussein, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really a really tremendous pleasure to be here, Rob. Thank you so much. Many thanks to UN Academic Impact, the fantastic work that you're doing, and to all of my fellow panelists. I've learned a lot from your comments and lots of interesting takeaways. So I'm going to start. I'm sitting here, as we all are, at New York University at the Center for Global Affairs. So I'll start more at the micro level. When I think about the integration of the SDGs into higher education, I look at what we've been doing. When we launched the Center for Global Affairs in 2004, the whole idea was to, create an opportunity space education to create global citizens who would change the world and to empower them with the knowledge and the skills to go out and do that. So we've been doing that since 2004. But when we sort of think about what we were doing in 2004 versus what we're doing in 2022, it's radically changed because we had to change in light of the global challenges that confront us. So we very much explicitly read the SDGs into our curriculum, as well as offer our students opportunities to engage with the SDGs, working with the private sector through what we call consulting practicums, where we're bringing the private sector, we're bringing non-governmental organizations, we're bringing the United Nations here to the CGA, working with our students that are then doing projects for the private sector, for NGOs, for the UN, for the multilateral institutions. So that idea of taking theory and very much building it into practice is something that we are deeply committed to, and we feel it's our responsibility as educators to make sure that the graduate students that are coming to us, are engaged in the issues, but are really thinking in a solutions-based way. And I think that's one of the big challenges that I see when I look around the world at higher education. Many of you have already sort of spoken about some of the obstacles, whether it be bureaucracy, whether it be sort of more siloed disciplinary thinking. And how do you sort of open up those interdisciplinary spaces? How do you create greater partnerships? Connecting it with SDG 17, that none of the sustainable goals will happen without tremendous amounts of collaboration and cooperation. Last week, NYU hosted the Minister of Education in Indonesia. And I have to say, I was kind of blown away because I think Indonesia is a very interesting example of really radically reimagining education and reimagining higher education. And that has come with a lot of disruptions, right? And not everyone is behind those disruptions. But the minister, I think, is a very forward-thinking individual, has built a team that really sort of sees not only the challenges that exist within Indonesia, but also the regional challenges. And how do you prepare students in universities, in graduate programs in Indonesia to really be able to work to address those challenges. So bringing students into Indonesian industries, really engaging them with, not just book knowledge, but actually, working with organizations, working with companies to say, okay, how do we move this forward? So then when they graduate, they're also equipped with the requisite skills so they can go and work. Now, he admitted that with these changes, he's had a lot of pushback. It hasn't been easy. He's used a lot of technology. But what you also see coming out of Indonesia, which I think is very interesting, is that its economic growth, its ability to kind of withstand a really hard few years with COVID, that it's actually come out stronger than some of the other countries in its region. And I do think that, forward thinking around education from year one through university and graduate school, I think is a really sort of pivotal part that goes to Jeffrey Sachs' point. We're not going to achieve any of the SDGs without education. So what does that mean in terms of how we design curriculum that aligns with the SDGs, that aligns with how do we address gender inequality, how do we address climate change, which is something that I work very specifically in. And it requires, again, we have to take students out of the classroom. I'm just coming off of a week of doing a 3-day climate justice lab where NYU worked with the State University of New York, worked with the mayor's office here in New York City, worked with the city of Copenhagen, worked with Bramble, which is based in Denmark. And we looked at the issue of climate justice as it relates here to New York City, but took it to a more global level. And I think, in a conversation that I had yesterday with someone from Bramble, she said, 10 years ago, she would not be doing this type of work. She would be in New York, working with NYU, working with the City University of New York. She said it wouldn't have been, she wouldn't have been incentivized to do it. And now Bramble sees it as being a really important part of its branding, that it's not just sort of a corporation that's doing important work in terms of urban planning and sustainability and engineering, but it's engaging with institutions of higher education, it's engaging with students. It sees it as really sort of vital. Also, we need young people to come into our company. How are we preparing them? How are we engaging with them? How are we cooperating with higher education institutions? Again, it's not just here in North America, but it is around the world. I think we need a pretty dramatic reimagining of higher education. I think many of the issues that have been brought forward this morning are an example, and sure the hundreds of people that are joining us over Zoom have those anecdotal and that evidence to say, listen, we're not doing enough. We know we could be doing more, but it does require a rethinking of some of the bureaucratic obstacles. It does require sort of opening up more spaces for cooperation and collaboration. It means more career-connected learning. I think here in the United States, one thing that we're seeing is that a lot of this demand is also coming from students, that students themselves are advocating for change and for change in terms of what they're learning in their classrooms. They do not want to be passive. They are demanding, they are confronted. I mean, young people are confronted. Think about it. I'm not here to read the Financial Times, but I oftentimes will sort of use it as just looking at the front page. We're confronted with massive global challenges. So today, right, it feels apocalyptic, right? Fear of the nuclear weapons that Russia may use, climate change, massive flooding that just happened in Puerto Rico. So students need to feel empowered that they can in fact make a difference. And I think that for me, as someone who has studied and worked with the MDGs and now the SDGs, I feel it's like my responsibility as an educator to say that yes, you can make a difference. I am going to help you make a difference. I'm going to connect you with opportunities. I'm going to connect you with the content knowledge and the skills in order to do that. So I remain fairly hopeful because what I see that we do here at the Center for Global Affairs, what I also see happening at other institutions that I've had the opportunity to work with, but it's not a given. And I think the work that UNAI is doing, the work that my very fellow panelists are doing, we need to be louder in our advocacy, we need to do a lot more sort of sharing of best practice. And I think we really need to just really listen to our youth and look at what they're doing. They are at the forefront of many of the movements for change. And I just want to make sure that higher education is offering a really vibrant educational space for them to thrive and for them to see opportunities after graduation for how they will be actually getting us closer to achieving the SDGs. So thank you all so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you to all four of you for those amazing comments, thoughts, remarks. And Carolyn, your last point on providing the opportunities for young people, in some ways emulating young people, raising their voices. In my view, and I sometimes use my very small focus group of 2 college-age daughters. If we don't do it in our generation, for us, I think older than everybody, but I put it in the same group here, they're going to demand it. It's just going to happen. They're going to force us to change, and it's just the way it's going to be. So we have to change what we're doing to stay relevant. Really, in kind of my view. And I'm going to just follow up with all of you with quick questions. We have about 10 to 15 minutes in the panel, so left. So I want to make sure there's an opportunity to kind of expand on what they said. I'd like to be a little bit more specific about what each of your organizations or yourselves are doing. I'm going to start with Meta. I mean, UN Global Compact has such an amazing network of companies, global powerhouses that have so much influence, as you said, that have much larger, basically, economies than many of the member states of the United Nations. So, and then you also talked about making education and the case studies and the analysis relevant globally. And could you just expand a little bit on how Global Compact use that, whether it's using global networks, Global Compact, connecting with those universities at national level and local level, and as you see the vision going forward and using that incredible network of people that you have from the private sector.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you for this excellent question. But can I just say Copenhagen? I'm from Copenhagen. Yes, so I need to talk to you about this wonderful project that you have here for the New York University and Hamburg and Copenhagen University. Terrific. But that's a conversation afterwards. But it's a wonderful example of exactly what we need to do more. You could say in individual context, and we're trying to say, and the local networks around the world, and how we don't do this systematically yet, but this is definitely something that I'm there to support. And right after this conversation, I'm actually heading up to the Global Compact office where we have all the local networks represented, all the executive directors, it's about 70 of them in the office. And I told my team, we're 10 in the prime office, to go up and engage with all of these wonderful people who come from all around the world this week to have that kind of conversation. And it has happened already, as your example is wonderful with the mayor's office and your students at the New York University here, and then sort of drawing upon other experiences from another country. And I think that is very, very important. What I'm particularly interested in is the South, the global South, because I think, and I liked your example of Indonesia, I think that too often we think of exporting our great ideas to the global South. And again, I was keynoting at the African Association of Business School meetings here a couple of months ago in Morocco. There's about 100 African deans there for business schools. And they were talking about, they were very interested in Prime, not because they wanted to engage with schools in the North or industry in the North, but because they wanted to talk to their fellow universities and business schools in Mexico, in Brazil, in Peru, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Indonesia. So that's the South sort of experience. And what they say is, we have problems, we have the dire challenges at the same level, we also have the solutions. We need to help educate our students and learn from each other to scale that education, to bring those good ideas, those solutions to our students from the South perspective. So I think that is something that we will definitely focus a lot more on, and in particular working on the industry sector, in the industry, as you said, think that particularly three items that we will focus on, that sustainable finance is bringing climate change into the classrooms because it is not taught. We've left it to the engineers, we've left it to the biologists, but it is of huge importance for business schools, climate change, and then DEI agenda in the broad sense, diversity, equity, inclusion, in the broadest possible sense. It's not taught in business school, it is not a course or a program you can take. So we need to carefully think about how we can push that even further into the classrooms and beyond the classrooms, as you said. So brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you about that. And kind of along the same vein, with you, Patrick, you know, SN has this amazing network. I mean, that's Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So it has, you know, really established itself in that space, you know, under Dr. Saxon's leadership. And I have to say that I was fortunate enough to be in a lot of the very first meetings of SDSN when it was being established, because it was supported initially by the person who was my boss at the time, Ted Turner, when I was at the United Nations Foundation, and you know, he became involved in SDSN. So I joined him at many of those meetings. I saw it build itself up, establish itself. And you talked about how, you know, organizations and individuals can connect with SDSN to take the best practices, lessons learned that you've had. You know, tell us how that has built up and how that sort of best practice network amongst the truly global universities that you have and academics you have, and how that could, you know, connect to that, and then how you can make it relate to what you're doing.
Okay, good. So I'm not the best person in SDSN. We have different kind of departments. So there's a VP for networks, which is Maria, and then I'm the VP for education. But I'll just link you with this little comment. So I guess where did the whole education thing come from, or the whole kind of philosophy behind it? And from my point of view, when Jeff Sachs was in the MDG project, you remember that it was actually under Code Vietnam and in the millennium. That he was a professor, so he had to do teaching, right? But yes, because of the work he was doing day to day, I guess he'd just bring in the practitioners and the UN folks and the leaders of countries. You know, maybe he hadn't got time to prepare his course or something, but the thing, what happened though, it's electrifying, because suddenly the students were getting in the classroom the science policy practice interface right in front of them, right? And this is where I started my relationship with him. He said, you know, because he's doing the energy project and you're in UN, it's multilateralism, there's everything, right? He goes, okay, this should be in every classroom in the world. Every university deserves to come in. So at the time, we were using phone lines and Adobe technologies and narrow bandwidth, and we were bringing all the universities around the world to come in and listen to these conversations. And it was exciting. And that was the beginning of our what we call global classroom, which exists today, where we have a class called Foundation of Sustainable Development. There's four dimensions of sustainable development, and we make sure it's the academic, the practice, the policy person in each of the topics. And it's a very successful course. But this kind of guides us now because, and I think people felt that over COVID. Hopefully, when people went online, they suddenly realized your learning system, you've got to be a little bit more precise about when the lecture is and what readings to do when you put up some information, right? And secondly, you realize you can bring a guest into Zoom very easily, right? The next thing you would go, well, I don't have to travel on a plane. So suddenly you have people from all over the world in the same room. I mean, this is what you're doing today, right? In the same room. And this is the essence of, I think, where we're going with our online masters and micromasters through the network, just to get it to the network. It's just that there is no excuse for us not cooperating and getting the highest quality material out to every student in the world across Europe. There is no excuse. We can all set up Zoom calls and have accredited courses. And this is kind of the beginning with education. And of course, there's no excuse for data sharing. There's no excuse for doing research, for policy work, etc. But my responsibility obviously is on the education. But I would argue that education is the foundation stone. If you have academics educating together, you'll find very quickly they do research together, they do policy together. It's the foundation stone, and that's what I would argue. Now, Maria might have a different story from the network point of view, but this is the, I hope this last one.
Yeah, I would say that responds to it quite well. I trust Maria would agree with that. And yeah, but it's all about those connections and relationships, and building those relationships between individuals and institutions. That I think that really makes a huge difference. So next I'm going to go to you, Carolyn, it's okay. And I'm going to go to what is kind of the first part of your title, as I have it here, global security, conflict, and cybercrime, which I think we're all really concerned about, global security, conflict, and cybercrime, and how that fits into your thinking about our education and the SDGs, and how you're tackling that and maybe weaving that in as you think about how we educate people around these global crises. I mean, it's certainly part of the SDGs and all the work we're doing at the UN and everyone's thinking about, but how do you see that and how do we take that on? Because it's a huge challenge.
It is a huge challenge. I'm really grateful that we have fantastic faculty here as well as students who are taking on those challenges. It's actually interesting because the evolution of the CGA is also sort of representative of, we recognize that cyber is a massive threat, private sector, government, across the whole board. So we said we're going to start a new master's program. So we launched the new master's program in the fall of 2019. We have a wonderful faculty lead, Dr. Panagopoulos. And we are looking at cyber from the social sciences and from the policy side. The Tennant School of Engineering is really great at the computer science and the technical side, and we're saying, okay, we have to sort of understand, how do we think about policy prescriptions? How do we think about how do we consult with companies to be better prepared? How do we think about responses to cyber attacks? So we've seen Chris Ankerson, who was here just a few minutes ago, in his class, like he'll teach asymmetric warfare, right? We have cyber we think about digitalization and all of the extraordinary opportunities that access to digital information has brought us. And yet there's still the weaponization, right, of data, of information, weaponization of the internet. That is, something that really needs greater attention. It's something that we're doing. And, what we're seeing is that, companies and governments are coming to us and they want to understand, what can they be doing in order to be better prepared. And this is a constantly changing space. This is not something that you can build a curriculum and say, okay, we're done. Like, this is a curriculum that is in constant sort of mode of iteration, which I think is also reflective of, in some ways, the flexibility that's required across the curricular and within higher education, because these challenges are so great. And, when you were talking about, making information available, one of the thoughts I was like, we still have hundreds of millions of people around the world that do not have access to electricity. How do we make sure that they have access to electricity? And how do we make this not something that it's a given, that it's a human right, that it's that education help. So it's, we see this as in the larger security realm, and we're doing it as we build the curriculum, what we teach in the classroom and what we do with our students.
No, great, thanks. I think it is always, how the hell do we keep up with all this, right? It's just so constantly changing. Sarma, I know you've been sitting over there for a while. I never forgot about it.
I'm always a student of
And I'm going to kind of go to the second part of the short bio that I have. You were the head and senior policy advisor at the resident coordinator system leadership branch at the UN Development Operations Coordination Office. That is, I think that's longer than I have. I'm not sure how that's possible, but as you think about that work you did, working in that space, as the UN was reforming itself and trying to be better at country level and be more coordinated, more organized, and dealing with, sort of non-state, non-government officials and working with partnerships. In the academic space, what are your thoughts on how the UN can do better as it engages to try and get these best practices and lessons learned as it works with, the universities at country level, and also connecting them up to universities that may have more experience working on SDGs. Did I express that question decently enough? You look very puzzled.
No, I'm thinking.
I wasn't sure I don't know.
How do I approach that? In the UN, I spoke about that transition from NDG to SDG thinking. And I've been for a decade, I was training emerging senior leaders in Stanford College in Turin, and then half a decade in New York, trying to influence models and approaches to leadership development. And in the same thing, I changed the title. The bad thing, I changed the title of the induction program for resident coordinators, called induction program. We look going to represent the Secretary General. And I changed it to UN Leadership Exchange. Because these are individuals who are coming with a lot of knowledge, 20, 25 years from UNICEF, UNPA, government. I'm not inducting them on how they're going to do their job once they get to the ground. They will only know that once they get to the ground. And by the way, some of them were on those for a few months. So my job and our responsibility wasn't to tell them what to do and how to engage in these issues. Our responsibility was, there's a lot of knowledge in this room, and I want to draw it out. Educare is to draw out. And there's nothing I can tell them that they may not already know, but maybe we can create a collaborative space for them to learn from each other, and then infuse that, texturize that with some new approaches to how you change. So we're creating these multi-level systems thinkers. With these leaders, and this is what I'm testing, and just I think the crux of the curriculum reform is, can you talk about climate change or human rights or gender equality without mentioning the words climate change? Can you have a conversation about climate change outcomes without mentioning the word climate change? And this comes from experience. A lot of our leaders going into the field and trying to talk about human rights to governments that not necessarily are really open to having that conversation. It's about raising the issue without waving the flag. So how can you get the attention? So can you talk about human rights outcomes without mentioning the words? Access to employment, opportunities, education, these all, if you bolster these have human rights outcomes, right to education, right to fair, equitable living, a decent wage, etc. So these are the insights that I believe from the crux of where the curriculum reform needs to come from, is when we're looking at integrated, multidisciplinary, bringing in different insights, 80% of knowledge is informal. That's 20% coming from these students, the young leaders, already know a lot. They have a lot of access to information and a lot of information that they need to unpack. And as educators, to help them navigate that knowledge, introduce some insights that will allow them they can tap into the guidance here and navigate their way through that. I would say that's probably should be the main focus and purpose of higher education, is to help students learn with purposeful intent, so their actions they understand are contributing to what they believe their purpose, in cultivating their purpose, and how they can be productive in their lives, irrespective of the vocation they choose, is to be able to survive and thrive in that world, and for them to be able to manage tensions and dilemmas and trade-offs in their lives, not only through programs that will help them cultivate that. I think that's one takeaway. If they can walk out of those halls of learning, they'll be better for it. The education is that force multiplier. And if we change the way they think, and use that with different insights for learning and knowledge, and help draw out what they know so they can connect to it, That's a co-creative process. It's designing that curriculum and iterating that as we go. The world changes, but also based on insight from industry, from academia, from different, drawing on different insights. At the staff college, we were bringing car designers and chefs to talk about design thinking, to talk about leadership. Because you can walk away with one new insight around design thinking, prototyping, experimentation, right? This is not taking the INSEAD course on negotiation or the Harvard course with many leadership programs only in the agencies. Take that, cluster it together, and here's your executive leadership program. Well, that's in the business world, makes sense. It's left to the individual to kind of repurpose that for their context in country of excellence, and that's not going to work. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Sarma. And I think we just heard from all four of our amazing speakers and panelists here, the collaboration, connectivity, solutions, and identifying ways to bring that all together and make it happen. Whether you're looking at the connectivity between the 17 SDGs, where you can't achieve one without several others, that connectivity, then connectivity between all of us within the academic community, but then across all sectors to make sure that we're finding the solution where they are and making sure that everyone has an opportunity to engage that. We unfortunately do have to wrap because we have our second online panel starting at in 4 minutes, according to the clock that's in front of me. As soon as we wrap, Omar is going to step up and tell people how to connect to that. So he'll step up here in a moment. But first, Carolyn, Patrick, Zara, thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation. We appreciate your time in this incredibly busy week. And thanks to all of you for joining us here in the room at CGA and all of you online. We look forward to seeing you next week.